Hello everyone, my name is Yifat Shaik and I want to talk a little bit about what can game designers learn from competitive reality show. Before I start, I want to acknowledge the land in which I'm speaking to you is from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Anisnoe, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. I would also like to acknowledge that Toronto, also known as Sacramento, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. So who am I? My name is Yifat Shaik. As I mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at York University in Canada. I'm also an experimental game designer. I'm currently working on games that are made in non-traditional game engine. The current one uses Miro, and I made games in Excel as well, and bots that examine issues around AI ethic. I'm not going to talk about any of those here, but rather I'm going to draw of my love of the trashier side of TV, which frankly I do not consider to be trash at all, and examine the game design of specific reality show, as I believe that there is a lot we can learn from them. This talk came to be because I really like Survivor, and I'm trying to convince more people to watch it. I should note, I try to make this talk intro into a more practical look at this show, with the idea that by the end of this talk you will come out with some idea of how you can use those games to implement your own design. But I only have about half an hour, so I will probably only whet your appetite and interest on the topic, or just make you think that it's not worth your time. I'm also an academic, so sometimes I can't help myself and overcomplicate thing. So on August 23rd, 2000, more than 50 million Americans watched the final of the first season of Survivor, making it a cultural milestone and birthing the age of reality shows. It seems silly nowadays, but looking back at the popularity of the first few seasons of Survivor, and later Big Brother, made the participant of this show youth celebrity, if only for a very short while, and managed for at least a few years to dominate the TV landscape until eventually being replaced by prestige TV. It is important to note, Survivor was certainly not the first very popular reality show out there. I want to give credit to the real world, and can also be argued that game show also can fit into the term reality show. And I think some of them, I can think of something like the Crystal Maze is well worth exploring. So this to say, reality shows are still being produced. For one thing, they're cheaper to produce. While Survivor at this point has a huge amount of people working for it, it's still cheaper than working on a more prestige TV drama. And a lot of them also share production with other countries. So the cost of running a reality show is still enormously less than other type of show. They're still very popular. While they do not reach the height of popularity and buzz that they had in the early 2000s, they're still very successful and a huge part of the media landscape. And they still get a really high rating. I think Survivor is still one of the highest rated shows on Wednesdays. They prove that they're here to stay. Survivor has 40 seasons. Big Brother, the American version, has 22. The Circle is a huge hit for Netflix. And then shows like RuPaul Drag Race, The Great British Bake Off, etc. We do not talk about the cultural impact. For both good and bad and very bad, reality shows have affected our culture. By all accounts, the image of the former president of the United States, and which helped him get elected, was heavily influenced by the image constructed by a reality show. And lastly, there's a lot they can teach us. Their design can teach us how to improve our own design. There's a lot of things we can analyze and critique about the shows, from issues of race, colonialism, and gender, to the evolution of strategic gameplay. For the sake of this talk, I'm going to focus on how competitive reality show, which I will describe in the next section, create emergent gameplay, and how player agency affects the overall thematic game. I'm going to look at the way the players interact with the system of rules set by the designer of the game, and how they use those to create their own rule and game dynamic. While those rules of the show do not change that much, the way the player use them and interact with each other is ever changing, creating surprising new interaction in narrative. So let's talk about our competitive reality shows first. What do I mean? So there's many genre of reality shows, and their popularity tend to change over time. From documentaries like shows where there's very little production interference, like The Real World, skill-based competition like RuPaul Drag Race, The Great British Bake Off, American Idol, etc., which are probably the most popular nowadays. Soap opera style like docu-soap and celebrity reality, like The Kardashian and The Real Housewife, which mimic sort of deliberately tries to mimic the appearance and structure of a soap opera. Home improvement show, which there's a full channel just for those kinds of shows, dating show like The Bachelor, Too Hot to Handle, Marriage on First Sight, etc. And there's many other genre in it. I would like to focus on one specific type of reality show, which I call competitive reality show, which might be a sub-genre. It's a bit hard to quantify, but those are competitive shows in which ordinary people compete to win a prize, usually a cash one. And they have a strong game-like element to them, with a specific game mechanic, the idea of entering a magic circle, strategy, procedurally generated contact, and etc. So what are the specific elements of the show? How do we differentiate them from other types of reality genre? So the first one is the prize. The show will generally involve a large cash prize. This will not include job offer, collection, etc., but strictly money. With Survivor probably has the largest prize, which was $1 million, and I think 2040 was $2 million. Because the amount of hardship they have to deal with and the offered affect the amount they get. And I think like the circle is much less. I think it's like 100K. Or the second element is ordinary people. The contestants do not have specific skill and are often chosen for personality and archetype they embody. And the last thing, which is probably the biggest thing, is immunity, in which contestant can win the right to be exempt the next time a contestant might be eliminated from the show. This allows for strategic gameplay, as the players are not only trying to not lose, but also to get immunity. In my opinion, as I said, this is the element which allows the game to become a complex strategic game, as players are not only trying to win, not to win or to lose, but also trying to be safe and or trying to prevent other players from being safe. There's a few shows that fit the bill. Survivor, obviously, as I mentioned, The Amazing Race, Big Brother, the American version, Canadian version, not the more international version, The Circle. But for the sake of time and keeping the talk focused, I will only focus on two shows, Survivor and The Circle. For one thing, I'm the most familiar with them, and while there's a lot to say about Big Brother specifically, but the two different versions of the show and my lack of familiarity with the American-Canadian version, I felt I'm not an expert enough on those shows to talk about them. I also think there's something fitting in talking about the oldest and the newest show of the genre. So level of engagement. You can look at those shows and games before the distinct level of engagement. The producer, the player, the editor, and the viewer, with each level separately contributing and helping with the success of the show. The producer, who act as both the game dungeon master and the game designers, they are there to design the rule of the game and make sure they are followed, as well as making sure the production of the show is running smoothly. I call this category producer, but it includes almost everyone involved in the overall production of the show, the behind the scene. That includes Survivor vast medical staff and the poor person whose job is to describe what the players in the circle say. While they are mostly silent, the host acts as their face and reinforcers. Sort of, we can look at them as the main dungeon masters, and their job is to guide the player and make sure that the game is run smoothly and maintain the illusion of reality in a make-believe situation. In some cases, like Jeff Probst from Survivor, the host is also the executive producer, and his control is much bigger than other hosts, and he can even change or modify rules on the fly. The amount of control the producers have is different from show to show, and reports of producer interference is always part of the conversation around this show. Survivor especially was accused many times of having the production interference and interfere and change the outcome of the vote. This has never been proven. Big Brother has also been accused, and frankly, the producer interference is a lot more visible there. There are actually quite a lot of fan theory around producer interference, which I won't get into. The second level of engagement is the players. The players are the people chosen to play the game. They are the one who produce the majority of the emergent gameplay content in the show, as they are the folks who are interacting with the rules set by the producers. Some of those interactions are amazing and wonderful. There's wonderful humane moment, there's wonderful strategic element, and some of them are extremely unpleasant, like a contestant being outed as a trans man. I don't have time to specifically talk about the casting process, but with a lot of them, players are chosen to fulfill a specific archetype and are often presented that way. In a recent TikTok, Kelly Wentworth, a Survivor contestant, mentioned how she her archetype was the farmer daughter, and so she was only allowed to bring in clothes that fit that archetype. The next one are the editors. The players are often filmed 24/7, and the editor job is to distill this narrative into a chunk of about 45 minutes, depending on the show, which tell the viewer everything that happened in the span of a few days and craft a coherent narrative from the footage they have. The editor have full control to pick and choose how to tell the narrative, but the narrative is also completely dependent on the player action themselves. If the players have nothing to show, even the most interesting editing won't help with crafting an interesting story. And the last ones are the viewers. The last level of engagement is the audience itself, which engage with the show as linear entertainment, sort of as a spectator in a sport event, and have no power to control the narrative of the show, but can engage in participatory action when the need arises. Example, anything like voicing their opinion on social media, and as well as creating games based on their show, which I will talk about in later section. So how does this mechanic of the game encourage player agency and create emergent narrative? How does the intention of the designer and the player interaction with the game affect the gameplay? And so before I give specific example, let's talk a little bit about what it means when I talk about emergent. This is sort of my definition mixed with a lot of other definition, and some of you might say, oh, this is wrong, that's okay. But this is just sort of to put us in the same place. In the simplest term, emergent is when the game allows the player to craft their own experience in the game. It is the unexpected outcome of player interaction with the system of rules set by the designer. Emergent is sort of a buzzword nowadays, as game companies are looking more and more into procedural technique, which will allow them to prolong player engagement with their product. The problem with that is that unlike crafted story, emergent stories and systems are not something we necessarily know how to design, and even how to approach it in a way that create an engaging play experience. So the single most important act of emergence in Survivor happened in the first season, and it defined not just the show, but the genre itself. Initially, Survivor was billed as the greatest social experiment on the planet, a show in which a group of ordinary Americans are left stranded on an island and has to build a new society. Most players took it to heart, and while they voted out a player every week, those players were generally the people who could not handle the physical and social aspect of the game. It was Richard Hatch, the eventual winner, who understood something that not even the producer did. Survivor is not a social experiment about who can survive in the wilderness, rather it is a complex strategic game. And in order to win, you need to deploy game theory strategy like the prisoner dilemma and the Nash equilibrium. On day 10, he formed a plan which led to his victory. He formed a voting bloc or an alliance with 3 other members of his tribe. For the rest of the season, the 4-person alliance dominated the game, voted out everyone else until there were only 4 left. At this point, the alliance was shattered and the game became an individual game. And while the strategy considerably evolved since then, the concept of alliance became a pivotal part of Survivor and other competitive shows like Big Brother and The Amazing Race. So there are other reasons that season was a resounding success. It was Richard Hatch's strategy that cemented Survivor's success and its cultural influence. It also formed its core gameplay loop, creating alliance and understanding which path you need to follow in order to win the game. And it was probably the main factor in Survivor longevity as it made the game interesting. Another sort of emergent thing that actually caused a new mechanic to be introduced was in, I believe, season 9, which was Palau. And in this case, one of the tribes, the Ulon tribe, just couldn't win. They basically lost every immunity challenge in the game, and one by one, they were just decimated until there was only one tribe member left, Stephanie LaGrossa. And because there was no merge, because there was just nothing left of that tribe, Stephanie had to stay one full day at the island by herself, surviving by herself, and shining a new light on the hardship of the setting. And it was such a poignant TV moment that the producers saw that and actually sort of introduced, they never said it to us, but they did, introduced a new mechanic, which is the Exile Island, in which players have to stay by themselves alone on an island for a day. And that mechanic already was introduced in the next episode, and sort of became kind of a main mechanic of the game for at least a few more seasons until sort of it became kind of redundant. But yeah, that's a really good example of how that mechanic, how the player and what happens in the game can lead to new mechanics. There's countless other examples. This is just a few of them. In the circle, again, fairly new show, so we don't really have that many examples, but we knew that the idea of the catfish mechanic, where player can play as different people and not as themselves, was a huge success, at least in my opinion, when 2 players who play as catfish go on a date, a virtual date. So Alex was playing as Adam. Alex was a married man, and straight married man. He was married. He played as Adam, like a very handsome single dude, and he had the ability to go on a dinner date with one of the player, and he chose Rebecca because they sort of had a connection. Rebecca was also a catfish, who was actually Seaburn, who was her Rebecca's boyfriend. Basically, there was a bunch of awkward flirtation and some really inappropriate questions, and they sort of started this fake relationship. Again, if you have seen the circle, they can't see each other. And at the top of the show, Rebecca pretended to be completely crazy over Adam, while Adam awkwardly tries to keep the relationship going. Eventually, Adam Alex was cut from the game. Seaburn actually was a finalist, but these 2 guys going on a date, these 2 not single guys going on a date, both playing totally different characters, that was TV gold, frankly. So a development of the gameplay. So I want to look a little bit about the development of gameplay strategy, from setting up the alliance in season 1 of Survivor to the far more complex strategy deployed today in most of those games, like Shifted Alliance, etc. The simple mechanic and the player interaction means that the strategy of the games evolve over the years. And I wanted to give a quick overview of those. I should note that most of this is based on Survivor and a bit of Big Brother, as the circle is still fairly new, but I won't be surprised if it follows the same trajectory. This to say, I might be completely wrong. So one thing to note is the way the game is played in season 1 really affects the way in which the game will be perceived in later season. In season 1, nobody knows what to do, and the overall theme of the game will be determined. So in season 1 of Survivor, Richard Hatch, forming an alliance, submitted the game as a strategic game that is based around alliances and making alliances and breaking them. With the circle, for example, Joy, niceness as well, and his friendship with Shaban sort of made the circle a far more wholesome game, and far more, I would say, soft games, or and while the game is actually fairly different in international version, even today, when you watch season 2 of the circle, that particular strategy of being genuine and nice continues, even if there's more complex strategies. By season 2, strategies are more refined, players make less mistakes, but there's still a few cases that will show future player what not to do. So in Survivor, for example, Colby chose Tina and not the goat, which was Keith, and I won't talk exactly what the goat dynamic is. And in the circle, for example, the use of Jack kind of was playing Emily, a very sweet, like sorority girl, failed the makeup challenge and sort of outed himself as a catfish. And more twists are introduced, and it's usually a much better season. Season 3, the mechanic and strategy are more refined, and dominant strategy is emerging. And this is where the game kind of gets a bit stale, and so at this point, new twists are introduced in order to counter it. So in season 3 of Survivor, the dominant strategy at this point was beginning, which is that one strong tribe will vote out, one bigger tribe will vote out the smaller tribe. And so they had to introduce a new mechanic, which is the tribe swap, which is nowadays a main mechanic in the game, which will make players basically have more shifting alliance and not just be only with the alliance with the original tribe. By season 4, new strategies are introduced, probably as a twist on the dominant strategy. This was very apparent in season 4 of Survivor, where the smaller tribe managed to basically vote out the bigger tribe by having two members of the bigger tribe join them as an alliance. In season 1, twists are more common, strategies getting more complex, but new dominant strategies start to emerge. So in season 5 of Survivor, there was the strategy of begoning still exists, but also a new strategy emerged, which was GOAT, which is basically choosing the weaker player to sit with you at the end, so you will definitely get the votes. So it's important to note a little bit about dominant strategy. Dominant strategy is the optimal move for an individual, regardless of how the other player acts. And they will quickly make your game stale, and so they need to be neutralized as fast as you can. In reality show, it's often done by adding a twist. In Survivor, it was the tribe swap, and then Idols and many others. The Circle Season 2 introduced the Joker, and Big Brother is filled with them. The dominant strategy can also create uncomfortable and often ugly situations when players are too observed in the reality created in the game to understand the repercussion of their behavior. The most blatant example was season 39 of Survivor, where the strategy was for the big player to be kept over the strong player, so the player in the middle will have greater chance to win, which is a fairly regular strategy in both Survivor and Big Brother, but it doesn't make the most interesting of games. In this case, keeping the player that was accused of sexual harassment over a strong player who happened to be the person who was harassed. So a weak player was kept in the game despite action that went beyond strategic, just because everyone knows they can win against him. And the person who accused him was voted out because she was a strong strategic player. Reality show as a game. So can those show work as more interactive game? The answer is both yes and no. The answer is yes, but we have to look what fans have done. Sorry. Rather, basically, Survivor does have an official release, a video game or interactive game. I think there's two of them that follows the original mechanic of the game. It's very, very bad. It's available to play on, I believe, archive.org. I post a link at the end. And so this was an example, but it didn't work. But it doesn't mean that the mechanics of Survivor cannot work in those in order circle and stuff like that. But we want to look at what the fans have done. So some examples are, for example, Survivor Alexa, which was a fanfic that used dice to determine the result of each vote. Survivor Edgic, which slightly unfortunate name, but it's an editing metagame in which player analyze the editing of the show to determine the winner. There's a few Survivor LARPs or tabletop RPGs, like Survivor College Edition and Survivor Quarantine, which allow players to play an online, usually in Zoom version of Survivor, and there's videos of those online, you can watch them. And there's the Circle Discord, which is a LARP tabletop RPG that is played on Discord. So what can we learn from all of this? So first of all, pay attention to your player, and as they're the one who's going to make and break your game. And like it's especially important in reality show, as the casting really changes how the game is every season, because the rules don't change that much. We can trace the way in which strategies evolved in these games, which can be very useful when looking at games with strong strategic elements of tempo competition of sorts. Dominant strategy will be introduced. Some ways in which the show tried to counter them. For example, in the circle, because players, especially catfish players, can just coast and just like be nice. The producer actually used the weekly mini games, which are usually like fairly nonsensical, to out one of the catfish player who did not prepare well for being a catfish. So Jack not knowing how to put on makeup. This will mean that next time players who are catfishing will have to make sure they're really prepared. In Survivor, the dominant strategy of begonning, I mentioned this before, was sort of twisted by having the tribe swap, and so making alliances that are more dynamic. 4, if the mechanic can only be countered by one dominant strategy, then remove it from the game. Edge of extinction in Survivor, when losing players are sent to another island and have the chance to come back to the game, really has one way for the player to win, by giving up immunity in the last tribal council. And so by the second time this strategy appeared, people were really, the players themselves really disliked it, and basically the mechanic was cancelled. 5, just because a mechanic was successful or unsuccessful in one season doesn't mean the dynamic in the next season would be the same. One world in Survivor was a great idea, but the players of the season were so awful that the plan didn't work. Exile Island was a great concept, but it ran its course fairly quickly. A very good mechanic will allow 6. A very good mechanic will allow strategy to become complex and the game to not be stagnant. 7, simplicity is key for emergent, but messy game can work if the overall gameplay compensates for the messiness. Big Brother and Survivor are very messy, with a lot of useless twists, but if the contestants are interesting and there's enough interesting strategy, the people, you'll be forgiven. Survivor Fiji has the worst twist in the game, but since the player were interested and the overall gameplay was good, it's not a bad season despite being so messy. 8. It doesn't matter if the gameplay is good, if the player are bad, the game is no longer enjoyable. Survivor World Apart had pretty good strategy and gameplay, but everyone involved was so awful that it became an unpleasant viewing experience. The games are often unfair, but if the narrative is well constructed and the game is interesting enough, the player will forgive you. For example, no player in the circle often do not have a chance to win, and luck plays a big role in Survivor. Give the player 10. Give the player freedom, but make sure that you still have control without being obvious about it. Adding twist to the game or no mechanic is a way to make sure you're still in control over the overall gameplay. The idol in Survivor is a good example. You giving a player enough freedom how to use it, but you're the one who decides where it is and how many there will be in the game. A little bit harder in the circle because there's only 2 seasons. Sometimes in 11, moderation is important. Something really bad thing will happen and you need to anticipate them and stop them. The mess of season 13 of Survivor would have been maybe not so awful if the producer would have kicked out Dan the first time he inappropriately touched female players. Okay, before I finish, just a bunch of links. This is some of the stuff I use, or some of the connection, some of the videos and stuff I looked at. Once you have the slides, you can check the link. And thank you very much. If you have any questions, I will be in the QA after. And this is all my information where you can find me on social media or the internet.